Big topic for today. What is a biblical response to DEI? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is a really hot topic today, so much so that books are being banned from libraries because they touch on topics like this. Funding for medical research has been canceled because the title of the research project might include a phrase like, the goal of this project is to determine if diversity and race influences autism rates. Others claim that DEI programs are promoting the wrong people to the wrong positions. It's a hot topic, and what I want to do today in this video is ask the question, what's the biblical perspective on DEI? Is this something the church should get behind or oppose? In order to do this, I'm going to take a warp speed trip through the New Testament and look at some of the key passages that touch on these topics. But the first thing we need to keep in mind is that DEI is a new concept or a new way to talk about these issues. The second is that the New Testament does not directly use language like this, but I think the passages are clear enough so that we can get a clear understanding what the takeaway point is. Let's start with the Gospels. Now, trying to understand Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John's position on DEI is rather complicated. You need to realize that when Jesus was wandering around the Palestinian countryside, he was basically in a monocultural situation. What do I mean by that? Almost everyone he interacted with was Jewish by faith. They were culturally Jewish as well. Their friends, family, daily business, language, greetings, worship, cultural conventions were all shaped by their Jewish faith. In other words, they were Jewish Jews. When Jesus does interact with someone who is not Jewish, the gospel authors call particular attention to those encounters. The centurion who asked the local Jewish leaders to then ask Jesus if he would heal his servant. The Syrophoenician woman who begs Jesus to heal her daughter, who then Jesus calls a dog. Not very politically correct. We do have passages like John 3:16, for God so loved the world, but that's kind of broad and nebulous. I want to look at specific passages so that we can actually see how this plays out. In John, when Philip and Andrew tell Jesus that some Greeks wanted to meet him, this sets in motion Jesus' crucifixion. Some Greeks that approach Philip and ask him if they can meet Jesus. Philip then went and told Andrew, and they both went and told Jesus. Now, Jesus' reply here is crucial. He says at this point, the time has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. In the Gospel of John, it's the Greeks coming to see Jesus that sets in motion his crucifixion. At the very end of the Gospels, we end up with a ragtag group of about 50 to 100 people. But they're all Jewish Jews. They were raised in a Jewish background and they are Jewish by faith. About as diverse as this group gets is that we are told that there are men and women in this first group of believers. So how does it go from this small group of Jewish Jews in Jerusalem spread to the rest of the world, the church going throughout the Roman Empire, and even down to us today? This is where the book of Acts comes in. The book of Acts provides the literary link between the Gospels and the epistles. Acts is not a comprehensive account of the early church's activity. Luke is very selective in what he tells us, and while his focus is on Paul's ministry and the expansion of the church to the north and the west, even then, he does not tell us everything that Paul does, but those events which communicate Luke's theological message that he's trying to get across. In regard to this, Luke is interested in the outworking of God's redemptive plan in human history. And one of the interesting facts about the book of Acts is that really it's a continuation of the Gospel of Luke. The two should really be joined together as one literary unit, which someone in the early church in their infinite wisdom decided to separate by sticking the Gospel of John in between the two. But I digress, and have a different video on that if you're interested. The book of Acts opens with Jesus' ragtag group of followers waiting in Jerusalem as he instructed them. And then in Acts chapter 2, the Holy Spirit comes upon them and something very interesting happens. They begin to speak in other languages. In terms of diversity, I think we can safely say that on the first day of the church, it starts out on a big D in terms of diversity of these Greek Jews. Now, the spread of the church out to other different linguistic, national, and different backgrounds is not without opposition. Jesus experienced it, and in Acts, it reaches its zenith in Paul's trials. As the church becomes more Gentile, there is more Jewish antagonism. And it's not without good reason. They really see this as diluting or distorting the Jewish faith. Joel Green writes then that the purpose of Luke and Acts would thus be primarily ecclesiological. It's centered on the invitation to participate in God's project. Acts chapter 6, the 7 are appointed. Lest we think that this is one big happy family, we need to be aware of the social and cultural challenges that Luke points out for us. In chapter 6, we are told that the Greek-speaking Jews complained against the local Hebraic-speaking Jews that their widows were not getting food to eat. And to a certain extent, we can understand how this could happen. If these women did not speak Hebrew, then they would not have been able to hear where or when food was going to be distributed. Or conversely, if they don't speak Hebrew, then how would the Jewish Jews know what they were talking about when they were asking to get some food? So this problem is brought to the attention of the 12. Now look what the solution of the apostles is. They direct the Greek Jews to select 7 men from them to put in charge of making sure that these women are fed. Think about this in your context. Let's say your church has a refugee ministry, and some of them come to your church leaders and say, you know, the women in our group are not getting enough food to eat. What would your church do? Most likely they would pick someone from the leadership team or long-standing member of the church to do something about this. I can tell you what they would not do. They wouldn't say, why don't you guys pick a few of your men to take charge of this food, and we'll give you all the money that you need to take care of this. No way. We want someone we know and who we trust with our money and resources. But that's not what the early church did. Now we know the names of all 7 of the men that were picked for this job, and we know that they are Greek Jews because we are told their names and in some cases where they are from. In this instance, we have an example of not just diversity in the early church, but also equality. The apostles put them in positions of leadership and authority and ministry to take care of a need within the early church. This story in Acts chapter 6 then leads into Stephen's story, one of the 7 leaders that were chosen, and we are given his first sermon and his martyrdom. Now the first thing we need to notice about these 7 men is they weren't just making sure that the widows had enough to eat, but they were also involved in preaching and teaching the word as well. This gets Stephen into trouble because he is accused by other Greek Jews in their synagogues that he is saying blasphemous things about the law and the temple, that Jesus will destroy the temple, a charge laid against Jesus as well. While these charges are trumped up, they also preserve an element of truth in his teachings. As a bicultural person, Stephen realized aspects of the Jewish scriptures and Jesus' teachings before the monocultural apostles did. If you go back and you read his sermon in Acts chapter 7, there's several interesting things in it. He argues that God's presence was not limited to Israel, but was with Abraham all the way back in Mesopotamia. He was with Joseph in Egypt. He also appeared to Moses in Midian. And the clincher comes in verses 46 through 50, where he states that God does not dwell in a temple made by human hands, but in the entire world. Now, Stephen's sermon provides a theology for the book of Acts, how the church will go from being Jewish Jews in Jerusalem to the Greek Jews to the Greek Greeks at the very end of the earth. And we can see this in Peter's opening sermon as well in chapter 2. he starts off with men of Judea, and the book of Acts ends with Paul's words in chapter 28, verse 28, where he says, the salvation of God will go to the Gentiles and they will listen. This transference from the Jewish Jews in Jerusalem to the very ends of the earth with the Greek Greeks. In Acts 8:26, we meet the Ethiopian eunuch. First, like many of the converts we meet in the first chapters of Acts, he is Ethiopian and part Jewish, so he is a bicultural person. The other thing we need to realize is that when we are told he's a eunuch, this lets us know that he would have undergone some rather brutal gender transition surgery. But from a conservative Jewish point of that day, he would have had a couple big issues going against him. He was a Gentile that was converting to Judaism, like many of the converts in the book of Acts so far. The problem is, could he have been circumcised? Second, depending on what they did to him, it made him ceremonially unclean according to the Jewish law. So when he visited Jerusalem, he would have had to stay in the court of the Gentiles. He couldn't have gone into the inner circle of the court to present his offering or his sacrifice like other Jewish men. Third, there's the question of sexual morality and purity hanging over him. As a eunuch and a slave, he would have been used for various duties around the palace, and these most likely would have also included sexual demands as well. When he asked Philip in 8:36, look, there's water. Is there anything that prevents me from being baptized? It's a theologically loaded question. He couldn't worship in the temple fully as a Jewish man. He had to stay in the outer courts. But does his sexuality and gender prevent him from being baptized as well, from being included in the church? Philip doesn't even give an answer, and you must supply it. Nothing. Now, when you stop and think about this, this is a really radical story for Luke to include in the book of Acts. Shocking in terms of who he is and his inclusion within the church. The Ethiopian eunuch is a huge point on the side of inclusion. Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. Now this story is not about the food you can eat. Remember Peter's vision of seeing the sheet come down. But it's about Gentiles being included in the church. Like the Ethiopian eunuch, this is a rather shocking story as well. The Roman army was not known for its compassion or charity, and in fact, in a few years, the Roman Empire will brutally destroy the nation of Israel, Jerusalem, the temple, and carry most of the people off as slaves. To have a centurion, an officer within the Roman Empire, now inquiring is rather interesting. He is also, we are told, a God-fearing man. Now, this term is often used in the New Testament to refer to people who were converting to Judaism, but not 100% of the way there yet, especially for men. In 10:28, Peter lets us know the crux of the story. He tells us, you know that it is unlawful for a Jew to associate or visit a Gentile, yet God has shown me, and the visit of the sheet coming down with all the food, yet God has shown me that I should call no person defiled or ritually unclean. This story is all about who should be excluded from our community and who should be included, who is in and who is out. Up until this time, Peter would not have even thought about visiting, let alone sharing the gospel with Cornelius. And then later on, he's going to have to defend going to their house and sharing the gospel with them and including them in the church to other members in the church in Jerusalem. This brings us to Acts chapter 11, the church at Antioch. We have come really far from the church in Jerusalem when we meet the church in Antioch. Without going into great detail, Antioch was one of the major Roman cities. It had a sizable Jewish population, and when Luke introduces us to this city, it has a very strong core of teachers within the church. Paul is only one among the group of teachers in Antioch. Imagine going to church where Paul would be just one of the leadership team. And a little side point, Paul was a Greek Jew. Like Stephen, he was raised outside of Israel in a Greco-Roman culture, but was Jewish by religion. Now, up until this time, the Ethiopian eunuch and Cornelius were sort of the exceptions. One or two interesting people coming into the church. But in chapter 11, verse 20, we are told that some disciples from Cyprus and Cyrene were proclaiming the good news to who? To the Greeks. Not to people that are God-fearing within the synagogues. They're going out and preaching to the Greeks. This is the first major outreach to non-Jewish people, and it's not surprising then that Antioch is the church from which Paul's missionary journeys will launch. Paul's first missionary journey. Hang with me, we're going to move a little quicker now. In Paul's first missionary journey, Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark set out from Antioch and go to Cyprus in Acts chapter 13, verse 13. This is where Barnabas was from, and so it's natural to go there. He's got all the connections. After traveling across Cyprus, they then set sail for modern southern Turkey. Now, on this first journey, they have a dual strategy. They hit the key cities along the trade routes, and second, they go to the synagogues first. Now, this creates conflict in most of the cities that they visit. We're told that when Paul preached in the synagogues, some of the Jews and the God-fearers followed Paul. Within a short time, this would then stir up conflict, and Paul would be driven out of the city. So what's the big deal? Why do things get so hot and heated so fast? You need to realize that the Jewish communities out here in these towns and cities were not that large. When Paul comes along, preaches in the synagogues, and then the God-fearers follow him, he was not only stealing their sheep, but he's also taking key social and economic contacts with them. In other words, within this Jewish synagogue, they now had a reduced marriage pool for their children. They had weakened business contacts. It had a lot of social implications beyond just believing in Jesus or being circumcised. Now, a number of theological developments take place on this first missionary journey. But for this video, the one I want to focus on is Paul's message that zeroes in on the concept of justification by faith. Therefore, let it be known to you, brothers, that through this one, forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. And by this one, everyone who believes is justified from everything from which the law of Moses could not justify you. Acts 13, 38 through 39. Now this brings Paul into conflict with the Jewish leaders of these synagogues. As a result, Paul makes a rather remarkable decision. Instead of focusing on his Jewish brethren, he announces that, behold, we will turn to the Gentiles. Theologically, we now have the basis for why anyone is included under the universal umbrella of the gospel and into the church. And in particular, you need to realize this is why you and I are in the church today. Totally pagan pagans out here in the middle of nowhere on a continent that the people who wrote the New Testament didn't even know existed. This brings us to the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. Now, you might think that the whole issue of diversity and inclusion within the church was settled, especially with Paul's missionary journeys. But no, changes this big and bold don't take place without serious pushback. When Paul and Luke returned to Antioch, other teachers arrived from Judea, and Luke tells us that there was a huge argument that developed between them. These other teachers who came up from Judea taught adherence to the customs of Moses. In other words, believe in Jesus and also follow the teachings of the Jewish religion found in the Old Testament. While Paul taught justification by faith alone, nothing else. Zip, zero added to that. This debate was intractable, and the leaders in Antioch decided that Paul and these other men should go to the apostles in Jerusalem to have this issue settled. What's really interesting here is that if you wanted Paul to lose a debate and get a bad decision, there would be no worse body of judges to hear his case. The apostles were all Jewish Jews living in the Jewish capital, the holy city of Jerusalem. And the decision that is handed down is no less radical. In 1519, James, who's now the leader of the apostles at this time, concludes that they should not require any extra requirements, troubles, or annoyances. He only asks that they stay away from four things: idolatry, sexual immorality, what's been strangled, and blood. Now, if you read the commentaries on the 4 things that he asked them to stay away from, you're going to get a lot of different opinions about what he's saying, because it's sort of shorthand here. He doesn't spell things out. But probably the first 2, idolatry and sexual immorality, deal with worshiping in pagan temples. And then strangled in blood probably refers to food that has been strangled or cooked in its own food, something that the pagans were known for doing, but was verboten for the Jews. So the second point is a practical one. It allows those that come from a Jewish faith background and those who come from a pagan background to be able to eat together. But here's the big takeaway from this decision. They don't ask for someone to believe in Jesus and then to be circumcised and follow the Jewish food laws and other practices. They follow Paul's theology, justification by faith. In other words, James set the bar so low that even I was able to get in the church. And yeah, you too. I see you and you know I'm talking about you. Yeah, we both got in pretty easy, didn't we? Now bear with me. I know this has been a longer video, and I'm really pleased that you've stuck with me this far. But there are 2 more passages I want to look at very, very quickly, I promise. Galatians 3:28 and 29. In Galatians 3:28 and 29, Paul writes, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's descendants and heirs according to his promise." Now, slaves versus free and males versus female were the 2 biggest social divisions in the Roman Empire culturally. And from Paul's Jewish background, the distinction between Jew and Greek was pretty primary for him also. Now, these 3 social distinctions determined how you dressed, who you could associate with, where you could go, what you could eat. They touched on just about every aspect of your life. And Paul uses this triplet of distinctions as sort of shorthand for all the different types of people that you will meet in the world of his day. So for Paul to write that these 3 distinctions were in essence wiped away in the cross, we need to realize just how big of a deal this is. Or to put it in terms of this video, all of these diverse groups, Jews and Greek, slaves and free, male and female, are all included in the promises of God and equal heirs of it. And finally, Revelation 5:9 through 10. I promise you this is the last passage, but if you stuck with me this long, be sure to subscribe and give it a thumbs up, because you're the type of person I want watching my videos. In this passage, John records for us what he sees taking place in heaven. He writes, "They were singing a new song. You are worthy to take the scroll and open its seals, because you were killed, and at the cost of your own blood, you have purchased for God persons from every tribe, language, people, and nation. And you have appointed them as a kingdom of priests to serve our God, and they will reign on earth." Now, Paul used the language of Jew, Greek, slave, free, male, female to talk about the inclusivity, diversity, and equality within the church. John uses slightly different language here to speak about the same reality. What this really quick tour through the New Testament has taught us, that in the past, during the time of the New Testament, during the present where we sit right now within the church, and in the future what we see in the book of Revelation, the biblical response to D.E.I. is nothing short of a wholehearted embrace of these principles. And it calls the church to follow and practice these values in ways that go far beyond what our culture, community, or government might prescribe. It's a challenge that I am constantly trying to practice in my life, and one that I find always needing divine help for me to learn. So until we meet again, peace.